Most people know Vikings for their ships and battles. The raids, the axes, the sails cutting through sea mist. That's the version that fills movies. But the real test of a Viking wasn't found on the battlefield or in open waters. It was winter, when the sky turned grey and the sun barely rose. When the snow didn't just fall, it claimed the land. When the cold air could slice through fur and skin, that's when survival began. Vikings didn't just fight other tribes. They fought nature, and in the north, nature had no mercy. Winters in Scandinavia were brutal. Not just cold, not just snowy, long, relentless wind that howled like wolves. Ice that cracked through rivers, darkness that lasted for months. For most people, it would have been the end. But the Vikings, they didn't just survive it, they used it. They turned winter into a weapon of their own, not with magic, not with machines, but with the earth beneath their feet, the trees around them, and knowledge passed down through generations. They didn't run from the cold. They embraced it, learned its patterns, and most of all, they built for it. See, the real genius of Viking survival didn't come from war, but from their homes. Let's talk about the Longhouse. It wasn't just a home. It was a survival machine, built not just to stand through snow and storm, but to fight them. Everything, every beam, every wall, every layer of roof was there for one reason: warmth. A longhouse could stretch over 20 meters. But unlike modern houses that tower high and wide, Viking homes stayed low to the ground. Why? Because wind, that biting, freezing wind, loved tall walls. So they took that away. The shape of the house let the wind glide over, not push in. The skeleton of these homes was thick wood. Posts dug deep into frozen ground or set on stone when the soil was too hard. This wood held the weight of snow, heavy snow, the kind that could crush a weak roof in days, inside the walls. That's where the magic really began. Depending on where they lived, Vikings used different tricks. In forests, they stacked timber logs like puzzle pieces, sealed with moss or mud. In treeless lands like Iceland, they turned to stone or thick turf, heavy earth covered in grass. Some even wove wood between upright posts like baskets on a giant scale. Then they smeared a thick paste over it, a mix of clay, mud, straw, and dung. It sounds nasty, but once dry, it was hard as stone and warmer than you'd think. Many homes had double walls, with straw or moss packed between. Imagine that, early insulation, like a Viking sandwich made of warmth. Smart, right? And the roof? That was a masterpiece. The base layer was wood or birch bark, waterproof and tough. But then came the secret weapon, turf. Vikings sliced thick, heavy grass-covered earth from the ground and carried it up to the roof. They laid it in overlapping rows, grass side up. It was heavy, but that's what made it perfect. The weight sealed the home like a lid. No drafts, no leaks. When snow piled on top, it only helped. Snow was free insulation, a gift from the enemy. The colder it got outside, the warmer it stayed inside. Underneath all this, the floor played its own role. In older homes, it was just packed earth, but even that was layered with dry straw or rushes to soak up moisture, to give a bit of cushion, and to fight the freeze. In richer homes, they raised the floors with wood over stone or logs, a little air gap to stop the cold from creeping up from below. But the heart of the home, where everyone gathered, where stories were told, where warmth began, was the hearth. A fire burned in the center of every longhouse, always, day and night. It wasn't just a place to cook, it was life itself. There were no chimneys, so the smoke filled the air. But even that had a purpose. The smoke warmed the space, pushed heat back down, and even kept bugs away. It was smoky, sure, but it was better than freezing. And the door, tiny. You had to duck to get in. But that wasn't poor design. That was Viking wisdom. The smaller the door, the less heat escaped. Some doors even had fur curtains inside, double-sealed like a modern freezer. Every inch of a Viking longhouse was made to fight winter. Not just to endure it, but to use it. The snow, the earth, the animals, the fire, the smoke, all part of one great machine. A home that didn't just stand still in the cold, but pushed back against it, and this was just the beginning. Inside the longhouse, winter didn't just knock on the door. It sat outside every second, waiting for a mistake. So the Vikings couldn't afford mistakes. Every detail mattered. Every gap, every board, every piece of moss stuffed into a crack. It all added up to life or death when the winds howled through the forests and across the icy plains. One thing people often forget is how dark winter was for them. Not just cold, but black. In some parts of Scandinavia, the sun barely rose during the coldest months, sometimes only for a couple of hours a day. That kind of darkness eats at the mind, but the Vikings didn't waste energy lighting big open rooms. In fact, most Viking longhouses had no windows at all. No glass, no holes, just solid walls. Some, if they had the materials, used stretched animal bladder or thin leather to cover a tiny opening, letting in just a little bit of light. The rest of the light came from fire, from the hearth, from small lamps carved from stone or shaped from clay, filled with animal fat and a tiny wick. They didn't give off much light, but they didn't need to. The darkness helped keep heat in, and after a while your eyes got used to it. That's another thing. Viking homes weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for survival, but that didn't mean they were careless or dirty. In fact, their homes were often smarter than many modern houses when it came to keeping warm. Let's talk about the animals. Believe it or not, many longhouses didn't just shelter people. They sheltered goats, sheep, and even cows.
Sounds odd, right?
But it was genius. Animals give off body heat. A cow's breath, the warmth of a sheep's wool, the movement of hooves, it all creates heat. So the Vikings built their homes to include a section for livestock, usually at one end of the house. A simple wooden wall separated the animals from the people, but the warmth still flowed through. They were like living radiators. And the smell. Yeah, it wasn't great, but when the choice was smell or frostbite, you picked smell every time. Inside, the layout of the longhouse was tight and close. No extra rooms, no wasted space. Benches were often built directly into the walls, raised off the floor to avoid the cold earth. People sat on them, slept on them, even stored tools underneath them. Families slept together side by side, wrapped in thick animal furs. Body heat was precious, and the more people slept close, the warmer everyone stayed. Privacy didn't exist. But warmth did, and warmth was everything. Even storage was part of the plan. Above the hearth, Vikings built simple racks or shelves to hold food, herbs, or supplies. Why? Because heat rises. Keeping things up there meant they stayed dry and didn't freeze. It was like having a natural oven floating in the middle of the room. And then there was the fire. The fire wasn't just started every morning. It was never allowed to go out. In the worst winters, some families kept the hearth burning for months without stopping. Embers were pushed to one side, while fresh wood was added to the other. If they needed to light another fire, for example in a separate building, they used a stick lit from the hearth. Fire was life. It was sacred. It was survival. They didn't have matches. They didn't have gas stoves. Losing the fire in the middle of a snowstorm could mean death. So they watched it, tended to it, protected it like it was part of the family. And then there was something even smarter, something you might not expect from people often painted as wild and savage: insulation tricks, little details that made a big difference. For example, some longhouses had double doors or animal hides hung over the entryway inside. When someone came in from outside, they had to push through layers, not just one creaky door. That trapped warm air inside, kept cold air out, and in cracks along the walls or doorframe, they didn't leave them open. Vikings packed those spaces with moss, straw, even sheep wool, whatever they had that could block wind. It worked. It worked better than you'd think. It's easy to look back and imagine them as just warriors. But this was the real fight. Keeping warmth in, keeping the cold out, surviving when the snow piled high and didn't melt for months. Their homes were not just shelters. They were weapons against the worst winter could throw at them. And believe it or not everyone even had the materials or land to build a proper long house. For many, especially the poor or travelers or workers on the move, the Vikings had another answer to winter's cruelty. It was smaller, simpler, easier to build, but just as clever. They called it the pit house, and that's where we're headed next. Not everyone in the Viking world had a long house. Building one took time, land, tools, and a lot of wood. Some families were too poor. Some were just passing through. Others were craftsmen, workers, or even travelers who needed a warm place fast, not forever. That's where the pit house came in. From the outside, a pit house didn't look like much. Sometimes you couldn't even tell it was there. It just looked like a small hump in the snow or a low hill covered in turf. But beneath that quiet, hidden surface was a home built to outsmart winter. The trick was simple. Don't build up, dig down. Instead of standing tall like a cabin, Vikings carved pit houses into the earth, usually about 1/2 meter to a full meter deep. Some went even deeper, depending on the land. This wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Because down there, under the soil, the cold couldn't reach as easily. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. Even in freezing weather, the ground stays warmer than the air above. So by sinking their homes into the earth, the Vikings were tapping into nature's own insulation. It was like using the planet as a blanket. Pit houses were often used as seasonal homes or for quick shelter in harsh months. Farmers would dig them out for workers. Hunters would build them deep in the wild. Families with no land of their own might live in one all winter, and though they were small, usually just one room, they were cleverly made. First came the digging. Vikings used what they had: wooden shovels, bone picks, stone blades. The soil was scooped out into a wide, shallow pit. If the land was rocky or muddy, they'd line the bottom with flat stones or bark to make the floor dry. Next, they built walls, sometimes from vertical wooden planks hammered into the dirt. Other times, they wove thin branches between upright stakes, the same wattle method used in long houses. Then came the daub, that sticky paste of clay, mud, straw, and dung. It might sound gross, but once it dried, it turned hard as a brick wall, waterproof, windproof, warm. Some pit house walls were packed with thick turf blocks, cut from grassy earth and laid like giant bricks. Others were stacked with peat, a type of soft, spongy soil that acted like insulation. And then came the roof, the most exposed part. The part that had to face snow, wind, and rain without breaking. The Vikings used strong beams of wood laid across the top, either flat or slightly slanted. On top of that, they added birch bark, thick cloth, or woven reeds. And finally, the magic layer, turf, that same grassy earth sliced into heavy blocks and laid down like roof tiles. This turf did 3 jobs. It trapped heat. It weighed the roof down so the wind couldn't lift it. And it blended into the land, sometimes from a distance. A pit house looked like nothing more than part of the hill, and just like with the long house, snow was a friend. When it covered the turf roof, it didn't crush it. It added insulation. A thick layer of snow turned that humble pit house into a furnace, trapping body heat, fire warmth, and the earth's own stored temperature inside. Inside the pit house, it was tight, cramped even. But again, that was by design. Less space meant more warmth. A single fire could heat the entire room. The walls and roof held it in. The floor, sometimes covered in straw or animal skins, soaked up moisture and kept feet off the freezing dirt. And in the center, just like in the long house, was the hearth, a fire pit, carefully managed. Smoke rose up to a small hole in the roof, or sometimes out through a low tunnel near the entrance. It wasn't perfect. The air was smoky, thick. But it worked. The heat stayed. The cold didn't. The entrance to a pit house was usually small and narrow, often a tight wooden door, maybe with a few steps leading down. Round the edges of the frame, they stuffed moss or straw. Some added fur curtains. A few even built short tunnels, like a mini hallway before the main room. That tunnel broke the wind and stopped drafts from charging in. People slept side by side on raised earthen beds or wooden planks. They curled up close, wrapped in furs, sharing warmth. Pets and even small animals stayed inside too, not just for company, but for heat. And what's wild is, they worked. Pit houses were fast to build, cheap, and surprisingly warm. They were proof that even with no tools, no money, no luxuries, Vikings still knew how to beat winter with nothing but the land itself. They didn't just survive the cold. They turned it into a wall, into a roof, into a weapon. But winter wasn't just about shelter. It was about food, water, firewood, daily life in freezing temperatures. And how the Vikings handled that was just as smart. Inside the longhouse or pit house, the Vikings didn't just sit and wait for spring. Life had to go on, and it did, with routines built around survival, when snow covered the ground, when rivers froze solid, and when hunting became nearly impossible. The Vikings had to rely on what they'd prepared before the first snowflake ever fell. Because if you waited for winter to start preparing, you were already dead. In late summer and fall, Vikings worked like their lives depended on it, because they did. Food wasn't just gathered, it was stockpiled. Grains like barley and rye were harvested and stored in wooden bins or sacks made of leather. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, onions were dug up and buried underground, kept cool and safe from rot. Meat? That was a whole strategy in itself. Animals were butchered before winter. Pigs, goats, cows, whatever couldn't be fed through the cold months was turned into food. But they didn't just cook it and eat it. They preserved it Viking style. Salt was precious, and when they had it, they used it to cure meat. Otherwise, they smoked it, hanging long strips of pork or fish over fires, sometimes for days. The smoke not only dried the meat but added flavor and kept bugs away. In some long houses, meat was hung from the beams above the hearth, turning the very ceiling into a giant pantry. The rising heat helped keep everything dry, and if you're wondering how they cooked, it wasn't fancy, but it worked. Large iron cauldrons hung above the fire, usually suspended by chains or sitting on stones. These pots never emptied completely. They just kept adding to them. Bones, meat, barley, herbs, turning it into a constant stew that changed flavor every day. Some historians call it perpetual stew, and it could last weeks. It was warm, filling, and used every scrap they had. There was no waste in Viking winter. Even bones were used, boiled for broth or carved into tools, needles, and toys. Animal fat became lamp fuel. Skins became cloaks and blankets. Everything had a second purpose. Water was another problem. Rivers froze. Lakes disappeared under ice. But Vikings knew how to stay one step ahead. Before winter set in, they collected water in large wooden barrels and stored it inside their homes or buried underground. Some dug shallow wells near their homes. Others used melting snow, but only after boiling it. In the cold, even simple tasks were harder. Just walking outside meant risking frostbite. Wind could tear through layers of fur. So most things were done indoors. Repairing clothes, making weapons, carving wood, weaving baskets. The long winter months became a time for craft and skill. Every Viking, man or woman, had work to do. Clothing was a shield, not fashion. They wore layers of wool, leather, and fur, not just for warmth, but for survival. Undergarments of rough wool, overcoats of thick animal skin, shoes stuffed with hay or moss for insulation, and cloaks, heavy, hooded, waterproof if possible, pulled tightly against the wind. Children learned early how to sew, how to scrape hides, how to keep the fire going. In Viking homes, everyone worked. Everyone contributed. There was no room for laziness in winter. It would get you, and everyone else, killed. And yet somehow in all this darkness and cold, there was still room for ritual, story, and belief. Even in the deepest part of winter, Vikings celebrated, not just to pass time, but to fight off despair. Yule was their most important winter celebration, the same one that would later evolve into Christmas in parts of Europe. It wasn't about gifts. It was about fire, food, and survival. They burned the Yule log, a massive piece of wood that was supposed to last for days. They told stories of gods and giants, heroes and monsters. They drank mead, passed roasted meat, and sang songs, because winter wasn't just a season, it was an enemy. And when you're under siege, you don't just hide. You stay warm, you stay loud, You show the dark that you're still alive, and somehow, through smoke, sweat, and snow, the Vikings built a life inside the storm. But even the warmest shelter couldn't protect them from everything. Because outside those walls, beyond the firelight, winter had one more trick. Not snow. Not cold. Isolation. There's a kind of cold that doesn't touch your skin. It creeps into your mind. That's what made Viking winters so dangerous, because once the fire was lit, once the doors were sealed, once the food was stored and the animals settled, what was left? Silence, darkness, waiting. For weeks, sometimes months, Vikings barely saw the sun. Outside, the snow piled higher. Wolves cried in the distance. The wind never stopped screaming. And in that endless dark, with nothing but a flickering fire and the sound of your own breath, something else would set in. Loneliness, cabin fever, fear. This was winter's final weapon, isolation, and it was brutal. A long house might be packed with 10, 20 people, family, neighbors, livestock, all breathing the same thick, smoky air. But still, it could feel like a prison. No privacy, no escape. Just the same faces day after day, and in pit houses. Even worse. One small room, a low ceiling, no windows, and snow piled above like a sealed tomb. That kind of environment can break people. But the Vikings, they prepared for that too. Not with medicine, not with therapy, but with something older, stronger, and maybe more powerful. They prepared with stories, because when winter locks you in, your mind needs somewhere else to go. At night, when the flames dimmed and the wind roared outside, Vikings would gather around the hearth. Elders, children, warriors, mothers. They'd sit on fur-covered benches, wrapped in wool and skin, and listen to the skalds, the storytellers. And these weren't bedtime tales, they were epic sagas, full of blood, gods, betrayal, monsters, and glory. The kind of stories that made the fire feel hotter, even as the cold pressed at the walls. They told of Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed his own eye for wisdom. Of Thor, who battled frost giants and split mountains with his hammer. Of Loki, the trickster, who laughed as he brought ruin to gods and men alike. These weren't just entertainment, they were armor for the mind. They reminded everyone, even the youngest, that struggle was part of life. That winter wasn't a curse, but a test, and that surviving it made you stronger than the weak lands to the south. Songs were sung, slow, low, heavy songs. Drums made of stretched animal hide, horns carved from bone. They played music that sounded like the earth itself was humming beneath your feet. Even games were played. Simple ones, dice made from bones or games scratched into wooden boards. They didn't need much, just distraction, just something to break the silence. And religion. It wasn't something kept outside the home. It lived inside. Many homes had small altars, a carved figure of Thor or Freya or some other god placed above the hearth. Offerings of food, drops of mead, a sliver of bone, left as thanks, or maybe out of fear or habit, it didn't matter. When winter pressed in, even the strongest warriors looked to something greater. And death, it was always close. When a blizzard hit, when illness came, when the firewood ran low, someone might not make it. And so funerals in winter were different. Burials weren't always possible in frozen earth, so bodies were sometimes wrapped in cloth and placed in snow graves, stored until the ground thawed. It sounds harsh, and it was, but there was no other way. And people knew when spring came, the dead would be honored properly. But while some fell, many endured, because winter, for the Vikings, wasn't just about fighting the cold. It was about fighting weakness. Every hour spent inside those dark walls was a lesson, in patience, in strength, in enduring the quiet. And in that way, Viking winter wasn't just a threat. It became a forge. It broke those who were soft. It hardened those who stayed. And when spring finally came, when the rivers ran and the sun rose for more than a few hours, the people who walked out of those homes weren't just survivors. They were sharper, leaner, tougher. They were Vikings, but survival didn't end with shelter, stories, or even strength. Because some winters, no matter how well you built, no matter how deep you dug, the land still turned against you. Next, we'll step outside the walls, into the wild, and see how the Vikings faced the snow, the storms, and the wolves. Head on. The Viking home might have been warm, but it was never enough to stay inside all winter. Eventually, someone had to go out there, into the wild, into the cold, into the snow that didn't care who you were. The animals still needed care. Firewood still needed cutting. Traps had to be checked, and when food stores ran low, someone had to hunt. But out in the Viking winter, nothing was easy. The ground was frozen solid. Snow covered the landscape, hiding paths, covering holes, masking dangers. A man could walk across a field and never know he was stepping on a frozen lake until it cracked beneath him. So the Vikings learned to walk differently. Light, balanced, alert. They didn't wear the kind of heavy boots you see in movies. Their footwear was simple. Soft leather shoes or boots, layered with wool and stuffed with moss or straw. Light enough to move quickly, warm enough to stop frostbite. The outer layer might be soaked in animal fat to block water. Everything they wore had a reason. Their clothing changed too. Thick wool tunics under leather vests, furs draped over shoulders, cloaks tied tight with bone or iron clasps, and always layers. Wool, linen, fur. No cotton, nothing that trapped moisture, because moisture in winter meant death. Hands were wrapped in woolen mitts or covered in hide. Faces were hidden under hoods or scarves. Even beards helped, catching warmth, covering skin. But covering up wasn't enough. Winter in Viking lands came with its own predators. Wolves. In packs they were fearless, desperate, starving. They followed the smell of animals, of blood, even the faint scent of smoke. Some Viking tales speak of men dragged from their sleds by silent teeth in the dark. Whether all those stories are true or not, the fear was. So no one traveled alone. Even a simple trip to check traps meant going in pairs, and not empty-handed. Each carried an axe, a knife, a spear, not just for hunting, but for defense. Because in the snow-covered woods, you didn't just watch your step, you watched the trees, the shadows, the wind. You listened. Vikings also understood how to move with the land. They used sleds pulled by dogs or horses to carry firewood and supplies. In deeper snow, they tied planks to their feet, early versions of skis, to glide across the land instead of sinking into it. They used long poles to balance and steer, learning to read the terrain like water. Even ice wasn't always a barrier. Frozen rivers could become roads, sleek paths carved by nature, smooth and silent, but only if you trusted the ice, knew its sound, knew when to run. Hunting in winter was an act of strategy. Deer, elk, and smaller animals left tracks in the snow, but so did wolves. Traps had to be checked quickly. Food taken home fast before other creatures smelled it. Meat could freeze. Solid in minutes, and tools, knives, bows had to be warmed or they'd snap like dry twigs. Still, Vikings found ways to turn winter into an advantage. They hunted in white furs. They camouflaged themselves against snow. They used snowbanks as shields. In battle, they sometimes launched surprise attacks during storms, when no one expected a raid, when their enemies were half dead from cold. To the Vikings, winter wasn't just something to fight against. It became a weapon they used against others. Stories tell of Viking raiders who struck coastal villages during snowstorms. When others stayed inside, Vikings moved like shadows. The snow muffled their footsteps. The wind masked their voices. They struck fast, vanished faster. They knew how to suffer better than their enemies. That was their edge. Even at sea, when the water turned to ice, Vikings didn't back down. They knew how to break through thin ice with oars, how to read frozen currents, how to anchor near land and wait, hidden, silent, until the storm passed. The cold was cruel, but it was predictable. And the Vikings, they planned for it, studied it, used it not just to live, but to gain power. Back at home, the fires still burned, the people waited, the children told stories, the stew simmered, and out there, beyond the trees, under a sky full of snow, someone chopped wood. Someone pulled a sled. Someone hunted. Someone kept watch, because even in the coldest night, the Viking world never stopped moving. But not every Viking lived this way. Not every family had the strength, the tools, or the knowledge to fight winter like a warrior. Some were broken. Some gave in. Not every Viking survived the winter. That's a truth often buried under the legends. We hear about the raids, the heroes, the feasts, but we don't hear about the ones who froze to death quietly in their beds. The ones who didn't have enough firewood. The ones who miscalculated the food. The ones whose homes cracked under snow they thought they could bear. For them, winter wasn't a challenge. It was a sentence. And in the darkest corners of Viking history, there are stories of families that never saw spring. Whole farmsteads found frozen in place, bodies still wrapped in furs, food bowls half full, fires long dead in the hearth, people too poor to stock up, too weak to fix their roofs, too proud to ask for help. The North didn't care about pride. But what's more Viking than surviving, learning, adapting, making sure it doesn't happen again? So even in death, even in failure, the Vikings gained something: wisdom. They studied the mistakes. A roof that collapsed under wet snow. Next year, the pitch was made steeper. A home that filled with smoke and choked its people. The next was built with better vent holes. A family that starved too early in winter. It became a lesson in rationing and harvest planning. And if you think the Vikings didn't take those things seriously, think again. Because to them, the dead weren't just gone. They were warnings. In some parts of Scandinavia, the bodies of those who perished in the cold weren't just buried and forgotten. They were remembered in stories, not as shame, but as reminders. Tales of the frostbitten clan or the house of empty fire were whispered not to scare children, but to teach them. Winter was ruthless, and it didn't forgive mistakes. But this wasn't just about better homes. It became about stronger communities. See, in the early days, Viking homes were isolated, one farm here, another miles away. But after enough winters stole too many people, a new strategy began to take shape. Together is warmer. Vikings began to build clusters of homes, not cities, not towns, but tight-knit settlements where several families lived closer. Why? Because a lone family might lose everything in a snowstorm, but 10 families side by side could survive almost anything. They could share food, share fire, share skills. If one man broke his leg, others could hunt. If one home collapsed, the others could shelter the family. It was early community living, born from necessity, not kindness. Even resource pooling became common. One house might have the best hearth, so people gathered there during the worst nights. Another family might have extra smoked meat. They traded it for wool or tools. Trade didn't stop in winter. In fact, it became more valuable. Salt, dried fish, honey, iron nails, leather, all these became winter currency. People learned to think ahead, not just for themselves, but for others, because one weak link could bring down the whole chain. And when the snow melted and spring returned, the survivors rebuilt again and again with better knowledge. That's how Viking survival became more than individual strength. It became collective memory, a culture shaped not just by the axe and the sea, but by the firewood counted in October, and the footsteps left in fresh snow. And over time, this learning became tradition, passed down not as books, but as stories around the hearth. Build your roof like old. Bjarni, his house didn't fall when the storm came. Keep your meat like Solveig did. Her stew never ran out. Don't forget the pit house trick. From the western lands, warmer than a noble's hall. Their wisdom wasn't written, it was lived, and that's the true Viking legacy. Not just facing the cold, but becoming a people that used it to get stronger. And yet, there was still one more lesson the Vikings held on to, one that came not from winter, but from what came after. To understand the Viking spirit, you have to understand what they lived through every single year, not once, not twice, but winter after winter, blizzard after blizzard, watching the sun disappear, watching neighbors die, waking every day with frost in their beards and smoke in their lungs, and still moving forward. That does something to a people. It hardens them, yes, but not just that. It teaches them something deeper. Life is short, brutal, and sacred. Vikings didn't fear death the way many do today, because they lived with it, not in stories, in the very walls around them, in the cold air that bit at their faces, in the fire that could go out if left alone for too long. And that's why courage wasn't just admired, it was expected. Because if you had the guts to stare down a frozen world and say, "Not today," then you had the guts to face anything. It's why their mythology, their gods, weren't perfect beings sitting on clouds. They were flawed, fierce, they fought. Even Odin, the All-Father, was more survivor than saint. He wandered the world, gave up an eye for knowledge, hung himself on a tree for wisdom. He suffered, bled, endured, just like them. And Ragnarok, their end-of-world prophecy, wasn't about fear. It was about acceptance. Yes, the world would end. Yes, even the gods would fall. But what mattered was how you faced it. That belief bled into every part of their lives. It's why warriors didn't run from death. Why families still laughed during the worst winters. Why people still told stories, even when the food ran low. Because if you could keep your fire going, both on the hearth and in your chest, then winter hadn't beaten you yet. Even their funerals reflected that mindset. A man who died in bed might be remembered, but a man who faced the cold, who fought the odds, who refused to give up, he was celebrated. To die surviving was an honor. To die resisting was glory. And that's what winter did to the Viking soul. It didn't just teach them how to build better houses. It didn't just show them how to skin an elk or smoke a fish. It taught them something eternal, that life is harsh, that the world does not care about your comfort. And that survival, real survival, is an act of will. It's in the way they built their homes to fight the wind. It's in the way they dug pit houses into the earth. It's in the way they kept their fires burning through endless nights. It's in every breath they took when the air tried to freeze their lungs. And that is why the Viking legacy didn't die with the swords and sails. It lives on, in their stories, in their blood, and in the cold places of the world where winter still howls, and people still remember how to face it head-on. Because when winter comes, you don't run, you build. You burn, you survive just like they did.